This is Jessica with Legumes, and this is their presentation. They're going to talk to us about the front Jameson lot, which I am particularly interested in, have been from the beginning. Also, since I heard about the toxic stuff in there, because I live like right next to it. So really interested to hear what's happening with it.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So my name is Jessica, and I am the organizer for the Como Community Council, and I've been doing the project management for our Lawns to Legume program. I'm trying to see, it seems like we have enough kind of first-time people to just give a little bit of a background. I wasn't going to bore you all with the thing you've heard 100 times. Really quick background, we applied for and got a Lawns to Legumes demonstration neighborhood grant. And we have been working over the past year now, a little less than a year, 9 months, to install boulevard gardens and bee lawns to suggest blooming trees in the South Como neighborhood that we have as the demonstration neighborhood. And so all last summer, we were doing installations throughout the South Como area, and we were able to install 8 boulevard gardens and bee lawns, and we did 1 community garden at the Orchard Rec Center. And so we have one last piece, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So I'm going to share my screen as we talk about this. So first of all, I'll say, do you see something that says Lawns to Legume?
Yep.
Yep, perfect. Let's see. I can switch this over. I have like all of a sudden all of my kids in the room I'm in, which usually doesn't happen. So you're good. Yep. All right. So like I said, the grant pieces that we've done so far is suggesting blooming trees, the residential installations, community engagement, which you're seeing. We did little pollinator meetings in the South Como neighborhood. And now our last piece that we're looking at is a pocket prairie in the demonstration neighborhood. So the site that we have been looking at kind of since the beginning, and I don't even think we knew really what we were getting ourselves into when we first started this, was a spot right off of Front, near the Front high rise. That is on the corner of Jameson and Front Avenue. So you can kind of see the bigger picture if you think of the Front Dale Como intersection. It's kind of right down the block from there. And it's, I believe, 0.3 acres of empty lot right now. And you can kind of see on the right, just the formatting of it. There is a sidewalk that goes through it and a bench that's on the property. But other than that, there's really nothing there at this point. And so let's see. I forgot, and I need to look at my screen here to see. Was there somebody else in the group that wanted to talk about the history, or should I just keep going? All right. Julia says keep going, so I'm going to keep going. All right, so here's the kind of history of this spot. So there was a company there called Ecolotech, which contaminated the property by improperly storing chemicals between 1973 and 1984. And so the MPCA, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, it's embarrassing how long it took me in these discussions to actually find out what that acronym meant. So I wrote it out for everyone, so it was easier than I had it. So the MPCA cleaned it up between 1984 and 1997, and in 1997 is when it was removed from the Superfund list. So now it's what we call a cleaned up Superfund site. Okay, so it remained vacant since then, besides the bench and the sidewalk that's there. And I am a little fuzzy on the timeline of this, but the council did reach out to them regarding a possible community garden, like a vegetable garden, a while ago. I know there were still kind of traces of this being talked about when I started a couple of years ago. And pretty much the MPCA was like, like, unless you do raised beds or something, just because it is a cleaned up site, you don't want to do foods that are being grown in that soil. So it kind of got put on the sidelines. I think there wasn't a lot of like volunteer support to be able to do that. And so when we were looking at this neighborhood for a demonstration neighborhood, we reached out about using this to do some native plantings. And so we did reach out to the MPCA to see if native plantings would work for this site, and they did approve that to happen. We had to reach out to Ramsey County, who's the current owner of this site, to see if we could do that, and we just recently got the contract with them. We're still kind of going back and forth on the details, but that they said that we can use this site for a native planting. Kind of the other thing that's happening right now is we are working with Metro Blooms to make a design for kind of phases of this site. So our grant, we have about, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but in this grant, we have about $5,000 for this site. But we wanted to work with Metro Blooms to make kind of a phased approach, just in case we could get more funding in the future, that we could kind of see if we did phase 1, this is what it would look like. Phase 2 could be built out to this, phase 3. And so they're doing for up to $15,000 in installations for their design. So we just signed a contract to work with them on that. Before I go on to the next piece, any questions at all on what I feel like I've thrown a lot at you. This is like literally everything I've learned in the last 6 months or year. And so any questions on just like the history of this site? And I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer them, but I can respond to them eventually.
Not necessarily on the history, but 2 questions that you may address later, and I apologize.
Yeah.
Are they recommending certain plants that help with the soil to clean it up? And then my second question is, are people from the various districts able to contribute to add on to this grant?
I will answer as best as I can, and feel free, any of the St. Pollinator folks that are here, to add in. We did look at kind of the phytoremediation, which is the like planting things that could help clean up the soil. And I think, Emily, you're going to talk about this a little bit, right? Or a lot?
I'll talk a little bit. I'm not talking about phytoremediation specifically, but
You just...
Sorry,
Oh,
I'm good.
there you go.
I will touch on it indirectly, and I can answer more questions on the phytoremediation later. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, that would probably be best left to Emily. I know that because it is technically cleaned up, there's a cap underneath there that is kind of keeping everything in, and so you would have to go. We're trying to stay shallower than that cap, if that makes any sense. So I think Emily will talk about it, but right now it's not like, obviously the plants would be good for the soil, but it's not necessarily the goals in what we're doing. Just because of that cap, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to do as much as we originally thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then as far as the community, being able to help out, yes, this is all open to the community. We got, like I said before, Julia Brokaw donated a bunch of plants for our current planting, which made us end up way under budget for the installments that we did this year. So we definitely are, I don't know as much. We're hoping to contract with Metro Blooms, and they do love community involvement as far as doing plantings and things like that. I think as we talk to them more about this one specifically as a cleaned up Superfund site, it will be interesting to know what they end up doing as far as like community involvement, just because it might just be a trickier plant site. But yes, any of the things that we're doing are open to the entire community, even though we have right now an area that we're building them in. All right, any other questions so far? We'll get into, a lot more, but I felt like I just talked at you for a second.
I have a phytoremediation question, but maybe it'll be at the end.
Oh, You can ask it now, just so that we make sure we answer it if you want to.
I was just kind of, what was the pollutant there? And the other thought I had was, how far down is the cap? Because depending on what prairie plants we select and what the pollutant is, we risk pulling that pollutant up to the surface. So, but I guess I don't know much about the cap. So yeah, no, I guess a bunch of different little questions. So I probably at the end.
Yeah, and we can definitely get into that at the end. I can also send you a lot of
Okay,
stuff
yeah, just
that will
send
kind
me
of get
stuff,
into what exactly is there. The cap, I believe, and I believe Dawn would know this, I believe is 5 feet down. Is that true, Dawn?
Yes, the cap is about 5 feet down. And speaking to plant selection, there would be the idea is to stay within root systems that would stay within above that 5 foot cap.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, and we will have time for more questions at the end. I just was going to stop for a second there. The next thing I will talk a little bit about is funding. So we currently have $5,000 budgeted from our Lawns to Legumes demonstration neighborhood grant, which doesn't get you as far as you think it would. We do have $3,000 extra from our residential plantings. Like I said, those plant donations, and we worked with Sacred Spaces, and they just were able to really get the things done pretty quickly. And so we have some money left over. We do have to talk to Lawns to Legume about this, because we're not supposed to spend more than $5,000 of this grant on one space. But since it's such a big space, we're just going to check in with them to see if we can move that around. And then we did talk to Capital Region Watershed District about some funding. And so we will be applying for a grant with them to see if we can expand this a little bit more. And then as she introduced herself at the beginning, we were introduced through Julia to Emily, who was looking, well, we were started talking about a lot of the pollutant things as we were trying to figure out how feasible this all is. And she was able to talk to us a little bit about a potential research opportunity, which may or may not happen and may or may not come with funding. So we wanted to invite her to come and talk a little bit about her area of expertise. She's going to share with us a little bit now. I have a little slide for her. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Emily? And I have the slides on here. Would you rather share your screen, or are you okay just telling me to switch?
Oh, thank you, Jessica. I'm fine having you switch if you have the second set that I sent you.
Yeah. Yes, I do.
Oh, except it looks like the format's a little. Could I share
Yeah,
my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Let me just share my screen. If
All
that's
right.
okay.
I'll stop sharing.
Then I don't have to ask you over and over again either. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Can you see that? Great. Shoot. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about a bigger project that this site could potentially fit into, which could open up opportunities for collaboration and possible future funding as well. So I'm going to give a little bit of background first about a bigger research project that we're working on, and then talk a little bit about what specifically that research project could offer this site and your community. So I'm part of a project, a collaborative project looking at the ecology and also the evolutionary biology of urban contaminants. So how contaminants are moving through urban ecosystems and how organisms are adapting to those contaminants. And this is part of an even bigger project called the Minneapolis-St. Paul Long-Term Ecological Research Program. And the idea here is that we're studying the Twin Cities as sort of a model ecosystem, but you cannot understand urban ecosystems without understanding the interactions between humans and nature. And so this contaminants work is a collaborative project. There are a whole bunch of people involved. I want to give you sort of the high level of what we're doing with the contaminants project, and then 3 specific things. So we're interested in a number of urban contaminants. We're interested in fertilizers and nutrient pollution. We're interested in salt pollution. We're interested in microplastics, and we're also really interested in heavy metals. So there are a bunch of heavy metals that we're studying, in these and more, about 12 different heavy metals, how they move through urban environments. And this is a big focus of our work, in part because heavy metals have important health implications, not only for humans, but also urban wildlife. So this is just data with respect to lead, and any elevation, the CDC basically gives a red flag for any elevation in lead in human blood, especially early in development. High levels can result in death, but even low levels can be neurally toxic. And lead, as in most metals, you can't really understand how it moves through ecosystems without thinking about humans. So humans have done a lot to pull lead out of the Earth's crust, put it into lots of things, and then that redistributes lead across the ecosystem, for instance, through leaded gasoline or lead paint. So this is just one example, and this is where our interests start to intersect. So these are some screenshots from some of the documents that Jessica shared with me about the site history and some of the contaminants at this site. So this top one here is from the 80s, before the cleanup, and so it highlighted a couple of things of interest, primarily chromium, copper, and those are the two metals, and also nickel. There are a couple of other things that are showing up: trichloroethylene, ethene, and a couple other organic compounds, volatile organic compounds. And then down here, it talks a little bit about what you see after the cleanup. So you're actually still seeing some chromium and a little bit of other metals like arsenic and mercury. So I will be upfront that I actually don't know that much about the other pollutants here, but it's certainly something I can learn about. We know more about metals, and even within metals, we haven't worked much on chromium, but it's certainly of interest, and it's something that we are measuring in our work. And so this is sort of the beginning of some shared interests between our research and what is going on at the site. I'll also mention, and you'll see some pictures in a minute, we're particularly interested in pollinators and plantings for pollinators. So what could we offer you? So we have existing funding from multiple sources and could potentially fold this site into some of our observational and experimental work. So sort of like free of charge already, we could do a couple of things, which I'll talk about next. But then looking forward, depending on how this develops, we could potentially apply for additional funding to do more. So what could we offer sort of right as of now? So first, we're doing a lot across the Twin Cities in terms of mapping soil heavy metal chemistry. And this is both the overall levels of metals and the specific chemical form of those metals and how they are moving from the soil into biological things in that soil. So this is the map, for example, for St. Paul with respect to lead. And so here's the approximate location of your site. It's in kind of a moderate elevated lead area. We've probably done the most work with lead, and I've also been linking this to lead levels in people. So these are the lead level, childhood blood lead level maps in St. Paul and Minneapolis, showing census districts with elevated blood lead. This roughly, not entirely, but roughly corresponds to soil lead exposure. So just today, because I know you guys have high chromium there, I started to look a little bit more into chromium mapping with the data that we already have. And just a little bit more background on chromium. Chromium shows up in a lot of industrial uses, including everything from tanning to chrome plating to the cement industry and glass cleaning. But the form of chromium that is flagged as of concern at this site is called hexavalent chromium. It's a specific form of chromium that comes out of a couple of industries, in particular welding, which is, I think, what happened at this site. And it's a carcinogen that you can be exposed through inhalation, ingestion, and also contact absorption. So I went into the soil data that we had, and this just looks at elemental levels of chromium, not the form of chromium. And this is a map, sorry, it's a little messy. This is a map that our expert mapping data analyst, wonderful person, Mary, put together this afternoon. And this just shows for St. Paul neighborhoods, levels of chromium. to kind of put into context the levels at your site. So in the 80s, it was around 30 to less than 35 parts per million in the soil. So the other sites that we've been sampling in St. Paul, and this little white triangle here is your site, are getting up to about 15 parts per million. So in the 80s, before the cleanup, it was about double what we're seeing in other places. I'm not sure actually what the levels are now, but we could certainly go into the site, take soil samples and tell you. But it says, you know, it's a concern, but putting it in context, it's not like off the charts relative to the rest of the cities, or at least a couple of these other areas that had past rail pollution. And we can continue to monitor because we have long-term ecological research funding here. We can monitor over time as well. The second thing we can do as part of existing funding is look at how some of these contaminants are moving into the plants that you plant there. So this is just an example from another study where we had a bunch of pollinator plantings and we were doing an experimental manipulation where we were watering them with a zinc pollutant shown in green, and most of these species take up the zinc as well. Some of the work that Lauren, who's on the call in your neighborhood, has been doing has been looking at bees in some of these areas where there's high metal exposure in terms of lead in humans, and bees that are living in those census districts where humans have high lead, these bees also have high body lead content. And so we're doing a lot with butterflies and bees, looking at how metals are moving into these organisms. So we could come to your site and sample soils, plants, pollinators, and tell you a little bit about how the plantings are relating to how the metals are moving from that top 5 feet of soil into the plants that you have there. The last thing I'll say that we can offer is to do some sort of exploratory work, actually testing the effectiveness of different interventions for mitigating metals. So the good news about metal contamination is there's actually quite a lot you can do to the soil to decrease how available it is to the plants and organisms in that soil. These are just some examples, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but with respect to lead and arsenic, what can you do in the soil that might make it either more bioavailable, so more likely to be taken up by a plant or a person, or less bioavailable? So changing the soil particle size, adding reactive soil clay oxides, like iron oxides or manganese oxides. There are a bunch of other things, adding biochar, changing the pH. These are all things that you can do to the soil to alter the availability of the metals. And we are experimenting with some of these in addition to looking at the actual effects of leaf litter. So the leaf litter from a pollinator planting should also decrease bioavailability of the metals because it increases the organic matter in the soil. And it also will, we are predicting, is going to change worm activity. And so this is another thing we're doing where we're looking at pollinator plantings and the activity of worms underground. And the interesting thing about worms is they're moving soil around. So in some cases, if you have metal inputs at the top, they're moving the soil potentially down further away from where people might be exposed to them. They're also eating the soil and potentially acting as chemical reactors that can change the bioavailability of those metals. And so that's another thing we're looking at. So this is another opportunity where we could put some of our worm sites at your garden and look over time. Well, what worms are there? How is the chemistry of the soil changing? How does it vary with the plants that you install? There are all kinds of opportunities there if this is something you're interested in. So this is what I meant by how I talk about phytoremediation. We're talking about it indirectly, how the plants affect the soil through the leaf litter that is dropped and the worm activity there. I'm happy to answer more questions about the phytoremediation methods where you plant the plants, they extract the metal, and then you remove the plants, but that in a lot of cases I think is less promising because it requires a lot of labor in terms of removing the plants. And the plants are actually really slow at taking up the metals. I just threw this in here. I'm still learning about, we haven't done much work on chromium, but there is some work about how various biology-based strategies that alter the availability of chromium can reduce the bioavailability of chromium. So I talked about biochar, so like adding biochar to soil reduces the bioavailability of lead. It also turns out to reduce the bioavailability of these bad forms of chromium, at least based on what I have read so far. So I will end here, and what I would love to discuss now and into the future is what kinds of sort of overlap there is here, what research questions are of interest to this group. You know, would there be, should we talk about it? Is it of interest enough that we should talk about how that might affect the design, or just sort of layer it onto the design of the plantings? And also what background information is relevant to next week. I know we're talking more about this next week. I also know that talking to the public about pollutants tends to be worrisome. I don't want to freak people out. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has said, you know, it's safe to plant stuff here. I think it is safe to plant stuff here. You're not consuming it. There might be interventions you might want to take in terms of like maybe wearing a mask if you're digging a bunch of soil. But other than that, it from what I've read, it seems to be safe overall. So I don't want to freak people out. So I will stop there. And I think, yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Emily. And I think, you know, when we first started talking about this spot, you know, one of our biggest, kind of even before we knew tons about the history of it, is we picked this spot as it is really close to like the front high rise and a very diverse and wonderfully in every way neighborhood. And it's been just really interesting as we've uncovered the history and uncovered different things, and then connected with Emily, that it just, I don't know, it seems over and over again that it's been a lot of work and a lot of research, but that there could be some really cool things that come out of it. So we'll continue, you know, to talk about this, but while we have Emily here, are there any, you know, questions about the things she talked about, like she said at the end, you know, things that we might want to know about this site as if it is a research space, or things we think the community should know about this space. Just what she was saying about next week, we're having an open community meeting at Front High Rise on December 15th at 1 p.m, which you're all welcome to come to. So that's what she was talking about for next week. But any questions for her?
Talk more about the use of biochar. Yeah, so in general, I will also give a disclaimer that my training is more in like behavioral ecology and pollinators, and I'm learning a lot about the soil and the chemistry piece. We're working with three wonderful soil scientists / chemists. But my understanding of the biochar is that it works a little bit like the way we use activated carbon to absorb toxins. There are all these like little reactive spots within the carbon, and it binds. It's very good at binding metals. It's very good at binding lots of stuff, but it will bind metals. And so it's more that you add the biochar to the soil and it takes up the metals and they become less available to the plants. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Oh, I was just going to do the teacher. Any other questions thing? Yeah. And if you have questions as we go along, I know there's some other things that need to be talked about in this meeting. Feel free to put them in the chat and we can get to them also if you think of them. I'll put my contact information also. Again, we're trying to get community feedback about this or questions or concerns from the community. So this is a good space to put those out there. So I'll do one last call and I'll wait my 30 or 20 seconds that I'm supposed to as a person. I saw Shevik.
Yeah, Julie's got a question here at the streetcar station.
Just the question about the timeline. How fast do things change when you add the leaf litter or some of these strategies? Are we talking one season or 20 seasons or?
That's a great question. So the soil amendments, my understanding is they work very quickly because a lot of them are immediate chemical reactions with the metals that they're coming into contact with. That's part of the reason why I'm less optimistic about phytoremediation, because phytoremediation traditionally defined, you plant a plant, it sucks up the metals, you remove the plant, dispose of it somewhere else. And so like ferns, for example, are really good at this. They accumulate lots of metals. There are some other plants that do, but they still don't accumulate metals that fast. And so in some polluted sites, you would need 100 years of removing the plants to clean them up that way. And so that's why I think that, you know, the sort of direct physical, chemical amendments to the soil with things are much faster potentially. The activity through the worms is probably somewhere in the middle, although actually still within a couple growing seasons. Some of these worms will completely overturn the top 20 centimeters of the soil within 6 months. And so the deeper stuff takes longer, but so that would be a couple of growing seasons to move things down.
You had mentioned about the design piece of it. If we were to be able to partner, you know, in research, would that, like, how might we be thinking about that now? I mean, are we going to have to section it off a little bit more, or how would that?
I mean, that's a great question. There are different ways to do research. We can certainly come in and take advantage of and sort of like add on to whatever design you have in terms of monitoring over time and get some really useful information. But I think if you let a group of scientists design it, it would be a bunch of experimental plots that wouldn't necessarily, that would give you a lot of experimental power, but wouldn't look good. So, you know, there might be something in between where you plant a bunch of plants in a beautiful landscape, and then you put biochar in some spots and not in other spots, and then look at how that changes things, or like inoculate with worms in one place or not in another place. And so I think there are things in between, but if you decided you didn't want to do that, didn't want to do any kind of manipulation and just went with the design, I think we could just come in and take samples over time, and that would still be super interesting because we have a before and after. And so from a research perspective, that alone is super interesting to us.
What kind of permission do the people at the U need to do this? Who gives that permission?
Well, we'd have to get permission from Ramsey County, but we already have permission from Ramsey County for a bunch of other sites to do the kind of work we're doing. So I'm not. I think they would grant us that permission. I think everything we're thinking of doing would fall within the bounds, at least that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency laid out, which is not digging. We would need to ask them if we're going to do some soil sampling. We'd probably go down to 3 feet, not 5 feet. We don't generally core more than 1 meter. But I would still want to talk to them about that before we did a soil core. Yeah, is there an opportunity to post information on the research as it's conducted? So that's a great question. We can certainly, so there are a couple of opportunities to sort of be involved as the research is conducted. We're partnering with a couple of other groups in St. Paul, and in some cases they're so excited about the research, we have people come out and do it with us. And if that's the case here, we could totally have people come out and help us sample plants and pollinators and soil and stuff like that. We can also do like a meeting where we share the results and we share the data as we're analyzing it. We've done that with some groups, and then we certainly share it when it's published, but it usually takes several years to actually publish it. And actually one of the groups we also did a field trip to campus last summer, and we showed them what we were doing. And so like we're very much open to whatever the community groups are interested and excited about, we can try to facilitate. Yeah.
How long are you planning on monitoring for?
Well, our current grant from NSF, from the National Science Foundation, is for 6 years, but it's a long-term research program, and we expect to be renewed hopefully forever. But so as long as they keep giving us money, we could keep coming back and monitoring. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Well, feel free to keep questions coming in the chat. I'm just going to finish up I just want to make sure we have enough time for just general questions. And you can also put those in the chat too as we go so that we can go through that. So I'm going to share my screen again. All right. So I think you can all see this. So kind of the next steps for us for the St. Pollinators Lawns to Legume program, we are gathering community feedback in December. We'll probably continue into January. So Julianne has been faithfully flyering the neighborhood with information about these opportunities. We'll continue to do that for the December 15th feedback session. But we'll continue to talk to some of the people we worked with for the residential ones and people who are on our list to get feedback on this. We're hoping that if the community seems like this is something that they feel like is okay to do, that we will go ahead and sign a contract with Metro Blooms to do this work. Their design should come back in January or February at the latest. And so then in February, March, again, this timeline, everything depends on the thing before it. So we'll see how things go. We're looking to do some, community design input on being able to come together with the community surrounding this area and talk about get people excited. We did a community meeting at the Front High Rise earlier this summer and just had a blast, and we really got to know a lot of people. We got to connect with the management there, who has been super supportive, and there are tons of people who are very excited about being involved, really hands-on with things like this. So we want to do some community design input. We'll talk about the plants that we'd like to use, so that people can feel free to go over there and know what's going on and know what's being planted and all of those things. So I wanted Julia, I made the mistake in my email today of saying Julie. And as Ben pointed out, we have a lot of Julies in our group. So Julia, to talk a little bit about some community design stuff that had happened at the Autumn Ridge Apartments. And I believe I keep saying Bloomington. Is that right? No.
This is in Brooklyn Park.
Brooklyn Park. Okay. So you can talk a little bit about that.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Autumn Ridge Apartments, but just more generally about community engagement. I'm by no means a community engagement expert, but I did a project in 2021 where I interviewed about 60 people around the Twin Cities that do pollinator work or have been involved in pollinator projects to ask them questions about their community engagement process. And I learned a lot from that. So I'm just going to share a little bit of insights, but yeah, community engagement is, as we all know, is really difficult, especially in sites that, have been contaminated and have this long and storied history. There's some people here who've been living in the neighborhood for decades and probably remember the changes in that site. They might know people impacted by the pollution at that site. So kind of like Emily mentioned, it can be really scary to talk about pollution. It probably raises a lot of our nervous systems get activated when people remember those that might have suffered from this site. So, just being really intentional and careful about, how we're talking to people about the site and what we mean by community, right? Like I live a few blocks from this area, but, the people really impacted are the ones that live, right directly adjacent to it. And yeah, there's definitely been, because we're working with Metro Blooms, who's sort of a contractor and they're not always totally involved in the engagement. A challenge that people mentioned in projects across the cities is that, when the community engagement isn't done well, the contractor comes in to put in the planting and people are like, I don't like this. What are you doing here? Who are you? And so having some tension and conflict around that. So just as we're thinking about the installment, as we're thinking about the engagement, just being really clear, who's doing it and why, and to have people participate as much as possible and make sure that there's trust there so that there's not some stranger coming in and making a bunch of noise and digging up dirt that, might have contaminants in it. the other end of the spectrum of that is, you know, people not being aware, they see a planting and they put their trash in it, or they don't realize it's a planting. And so they think it's just like a weedy spot. So that has also happened, or they come in, they mow it in an effort to make it look really nice, but they just didn't know it was a intentional planting. Other plantings across the cities and parks or areas like this, you know, it might have a sign that says like, this is a pollinator planting. And so someone made comments at one point saying like, oh yeah, there was this planting, but I felt like I couldn't go in it. I felt like it was sort of separate, you know, from me, when really these plantings are to engage with and smell the flowers and really enjoy them. And so, you know, that just comes down to the education piece with everybody. So in a relationship or a project that was really amazing was the Autumn Ridge Apartments. It was this huge collaboration between the city of Brooklyn Park, Metro Blooms, and a number of other, you know, city agencies and nonprofits. And I learned about this through Metro Blooms, but I met with somebody named John Canara, who is the Housing and Community Development Specialist at Brooklyn Park. So Autumn Ridge Apartments is an affordable housing complex with over 366 units. At one point, the interior of the apartments were renovated, and through that process, they heard from residents that they really wanted the outdoor area to also be updated and have areas that are beautiful. And so that's sort of where they started to get grant money to put in pollinator habitat. They did community engagement for a few years before the gardens went in. There's over 17 languages spoken within these units. And so they made every effort to, you know, work with people, have everything translated. They worked with local community nonprofits that speak those languages. They talked to local radio stations that people of different backgrounds listen to really make sure that, you know, they were reaching as many people as possible. They also worked with, I guess, Brooklyn Park has this mobile like children playground unit. And so they thought a lot about how to involve kids at the meetings, making sure that parents can come and there's childcare there so that the parents can like listen to the meeting and engage while their kids are being taken care of. They also set up tables in the meeting so that kids could do their homework while their parents were there. They had grant funding for food because a lot of the meetings were around 5 or 6 p.m. And so it was sort of like, you know, come to this meeting, we will feed you. There's, you know, childcare for your kid. And so it just really, whatever people's needs were, they really tried to meet them. They paid project stewards. So I think they hired a few project stewards of people who live in the units and gave them a small stipend so that they were the ones who are, you know, taking their kids to school together, meeting together often. And so they were able to kind of use the project stewards to get feedback from people, you know, sort of share what their plans were and just make sure that there was that person who lived there that really knew what was going on. I think they also sometimes would give like $5 gift cards to come to the meetings. Just kind of like really anything they could do to sort of invite participation and make it as welcoming as possible. They also sort of co-created some meeting guidelines. So, you know, kind of coming together, thinking about, you know, how they wanted meetings to go, kind of like respect differences, and sort of read those guidelines at the beginning of every meeting as they were planning. So just sort of like things that seem like basic things, but really made a difference in terms of, you know, getting as much involvement as possible. I think this was Metro Blooms. I'm not sure who did this, but they had like big boards where they would have, and like little magnets of different plants. And so people could like come up and design the gardens with the different colors and plants and flowers that they really liked. This type of like activity was really fun for kids, you know, so that kids were able to feel like they had input in the process also. They used music and events to try to bring in, you know, kids that are a little bit older as well. So they just really tried to think of every single strategy to, you know, reach as many people as possible. And then in the end, they all planted the gardens together. And so yeah, and so they did this process at Autumn Ridge, and I think a couple other different apartment complexes. Something that maybe is less, it might be relevant also in our situation, but there was a lot of distrust between the residents and the property owners because there's an issue where sometimes if you put in plantings or you improve green space, it can drive up rents. And so they created these agreements and promises with the landlords that they wouldn't raise rents. It's a little different when it's a affordable housing complex because the rents are not necessarily controlled by the property owners, but in some of the other projects they worked on, they made sure to have those agreements, which I think are really important. I'm also a renter, and so hearing that was like a very cool thing that they did. So yeah, that's kind of the overview. And I think it would be interesting to hear what ideas people have for, you know, the place where we're planting is much smaller than the apartments. So yeah, so just curious like how we can design sort of an inviting event for engagement and facilitate it well so that people feel like their input is heard and incorporated into the design. So that's it.
Yeah, and we're gonna, start some of the community engagement piece, in the next few months here. But what's nice about the fact that like this is a pretty big piece of land, we will not be able to do all of it, that we can continue this conversation and build relationships and be able to continue to engage community members in what's happening on this site. So we hope to begin well this year, but hopefully as things keep going, that we'll be able to really continue that. So yeah, so some of the things that I'm kind of doing to prepare for this, and I would love, we're getting to the end of this meeting, so I'm trying to cram it all in, but that, I'd love any feedback. I'll put my email on, how you think, many of us live in this neighborhood. So how do you think, what activities would be best for this neighborhood? How do we, talk to people about it? How do we get people involved? And I know we're kind of looking for funding sources also just with D10 of how can we, the front high rise is a community that we would love to build a relationship with and continue to build relationship with. So I do think that there's a lot of great things that can come from this site. And I think one of them would be that community engagement and input and building community trust in that neighborhood also. Again, feel free to put, I know we're getting to the end and I'm getting to the end of mine, and I thank you that you let us take over this meeting because we really took it over. Like there's not going to be a lot of time left. So we will be doing community input, and then we're hoping the installation will happen, this summer sometime. We do need to have it done. Oh no, we've realized that it's 2 years. So we don't have to, we're hoping that the installation will happen this summer if everything goes as planned. Of course, we don't ever know how everything is going to go. So I'm going to open it up one last time for some questions. I didn't see any extra in the chat. Yeah, it looks like we probably are getting booted out too. I just saw that in the chat. So if you have any questions, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And you're always welcome to reach out. Otherwise, we are having another community meeting on December 15th at the front high rise in their community room. That one's just in person, not online. And so if you want to come to that, you can. But thanks so much for everybody who showed up. Thanks, Emily and crew. And it looks like Emily needs to go. Thanks, Emily. But if you have any questions, I'll put it in the chat. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thanks. Sorry, I have to run, but please email me if you have follow-up questions. So I'll see some of you next week.
Thank you guys very, very much for the generous amount of time you guys spent going through that project. I'm very excited about it. Thank you for doing that. Up next,